Now we're going to move to the fifth leadership failure that we see with Saul, and that is excuses. We see that Saul blames other people. Let me tell you, a good leader is going to take responsibility. He first blamed Samuel for being late, even though he wasn't. He blamed the Philistines for mobilizing. He blames the people for leaving. The worst one that we see is in chapter 15, which is, again, when he was instructed to kill the oxen, to kill the king, and to do that. We see not only does he blame the people, but he takes the excuse. He takes the credit himself. So when Samuel asked him, "What is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear?" And Saul said, "They," talking about the people, "have brought them, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." Notice the pronouns here. They did the bad thing. We destroyed everything. He took credit for the good that was done, and he blamed them for the bad that was done as well. Now, obviously, he did not get away with it. Samuel called him out for it. Samuel killed the king and did what God commanded to do. And at that point in time, he basically said, we're no longer going to be part of this kingdom. God removed himself from Saul's kingdom, and they transferred the kingship to David, even though David, again, was a young boy, and it didn't happen right away. Another great example of patience. David became king very early on. They anointed him as king very early on, but he still had to serve Saul. He still was a military leader. He still played the harp for him. He still had to tend the sheep. It didn't happen right away. But during that process, David learned how to become a king. He learned the patience that was required for him to do so. In our company, we have a saying. We say, look, you have a choice. You can make progress or you can make excuses. But you can't do both, and you have to choose one. Would you want to work for somebody that gives excuses? Would you want to work for somebody that anytime there's failure, they're going to say, well, it's not my fault? No one wants to work for that. They want to see somebody that's willing to stand up and take responsibility for something. President Truman had a sign on his desk that said the buck stops here. Now, does that mean that any decisions by anyone in the executive branch was the President Truman's blame for that? No, that's not what that means at all. But what it does mean is that he's saying, look, if it is my decision, that it's my decision, and then I'm going to stand behind my decision whether it was good or bad. We will always have bad circumstances. Reagan and Obama came into a terribly bad economy. Both of them did so. Reagan didn't try to blame everything on everybody else. He kept looking forward. He kept saying, look, this is what we need to do to fix it. And even when people were against him, including who ultimately ended up being his vice president, who said that his economic plan was voodoo economics, and that didn't make any sense, we still see that Reagan was a very strong leader that led us through that and brought the United States to moments of prosperity and kind of shined as a world leader. Now, again, I'm not saying that Reagan did everything perfect, but at the same time, we'll still see that his leadership was very solid throughout. He didn't make excuses for the circumstances that he had. On the flip side, we see with Obama he took over a very bad economy. He did not have the same turnaround that Reagan did. The economy did kind of flatline and didn't continue going down in the same direction. We did not see the change that took place. Now, some people could say it was part of the economics that was happening and part of his economic policy. But regardless, we see Obama list a bunch of excuses on what was happening. And I want to kind of read this off to you. This came from the Washington Post. The first thing is Obama says, you are better off than you were 4 years ago. Even if you're not better off than you were 4 years ago, things are getting better. Even if things are not getting better, it's President George W. Bush's fault. Even if it isn't Bush's fault, it's the headwinds that are at fault. Even if it's not the headwinds' fault, it's the inside the beltway tone that is to blame. Even if you can't blame the tone, it's the Gang of Six's fault for screwing up the grand bargain that made up the ante on taxes after the House Speaker thought we had a deal. Even if it's not the Game of Six fault, it's the Republicans' fault. Even if it's not the Republicans' fault, it's the 24/7 media coverage that is to blame. Even if media are not to blame, change is hard and comes only from the outside. Even if change comes only from the outside, you have to elect me. So you can see, again, part of what he was doing and what he was saying. He was taking everything that was happening from the economy, and he was setting up blames and excuses all throughout. And even though as a whole, when you put it all together, it doesn't make sense, it's almost kind of comical. But we see because of that, and what I would argue is that when you're blaming everybody else, you can't shift course. You can't sit there and say, wait a second, what I'm doing isn't necessarily correct. I need to shift course so that I can make a decision. One of the things President Clinton did in the midterm election is he saw this huge change against his policies and his procedures. So he started bringing in people more that wasn't that was more center than what he originally started out to be, so that he can end up becoming successful as a president. He actually, instead of blaming all the problems on everybody else when the midterm elections didn't seem to go his way, he took responsibility for it. Now, I can't remember if he said it verbally, but you could see from his actions that he did. When we make excuses, there's no course of us to change. There's no reason for us to change. If it's always somebody else's fault, then why do I need to change because it's their fault? And then that sets us up for some really bad leadership problems that happen from there. And we see that many times when we lose.